two-person rowing and one horse in a boat.
Yeah. Horses may or may not have made it, and they were coming in small numbers.
Welcome to Archaeology Books for Fun, digging books that aren't drier than dirt. I'm your host, Tristan. With me, as always, is my co-host, Barbara Clark.
Hello, everybody.
We are currently on the last episode of a book titled Hoof Beats, which is all about ancient humans and horses developed a relationship and went from being eaten by humans to being partners and important tools that really reshaped human history, like a major impact on human history. And so last episode, we talked about humans finally figuring out the whole riding thing and developing around that. And like I said, once again, becomes very disruptive to other cultures.
And you start to see horses pretty much going everywhere they are adapted to go to.
Yes, everywhere they can go.
There's horses being traded for tea and all sorts of stuff.
Yep. There are some very natural barriers, though, and in this last episode is how humans ultimately overcame even those natural barriers. So first of all, the biggest, one of the most obvious barriers is large bodies of water.
Mm-hmm.
And so surprisingly, actually, or not, maybe, we see humans start to transport horses over water fairly early, but early transport was not very efficient.
Right. And horses may or may not have made it, and they were coming in small numbers. It wasn't like a shipload of them.
Yeah, this was from Korea to Japan at one point. I don't know if it's this chapter or next one, but basically it's two-person rowing and one horse in a boat.
Yeah.
For every trip.
Can't really proliferate population that way.
That was happening around 300 CE, so not that long ago that we started figuring this part out even. Horses haven't been around for that long, like in human history terms.
Yeah.
We also talk about the Vikings a fair bit in this chapter.
We finally make our way to Europe.
Yep. Actually, we talk about in the Jutland Peninsula of Denmark, there is some lakeshore rituals and burials. And this is the same region that was actually talked about in Ancient Brews Chapter 6. I don't know if the author here is referencing any of the specific same sites, but these are the same types of sites that was actually referencing. Yeah, Ancient Brews, they were studying the beverages and stuff, and in this one, we are looking at relationship with horses.
Horses and beer.
And beer.
I see no problem with this combination.
Yeah, definitely could go well. We also, and this felt like a kind of a weird aside, but I'm going to mention it because it ties into our first two episodes. We talked very briefly about the Sutton Hoo excavation.
I was wondering, I almost brought that up, but then I was like, well, it's kind of like a weird aside, but yes.
Yeah, I think the point was ships were big enough and complicated enough that they could transport horses on them. I think that was the point he was making.
Yeah.
But it felt like a random, here's Sutton Hoo.
When you're talking about ships in Europe, you kind of got to give Sutton Hoo a shout out because it's cool.
And that's kind of what that is. And shout out to The Dig episodes 1 and 2, which are the first two ones we did. That's a callback way back there. Still very fond of that book. One thing that we don't hear so much about with Vikings, though, is how important horses were to that culture and how big a part horses were of Viking shenanigans.
I love that.
Yeah.
They did have shenanigans, for
certainly.
Sure. But yeah, I feel like with ships and then horses, especially the horses they had that were well suited for cooler environments and had their weird tolt gaits, if you're familiar with gated horses.
They're the first ones to do that.
Yeah, the Icelandic horse is cool, and it's a horse, not a pony. Don't ever call it an Icelandic pony. Apparently, Icelandic folk get really upset about that, but they're like the OG battle ponies.
Yeah.
They're so cool, and I can see how having ships and horses would make you pretty big force to be reckoned with.
Talk about mobility, huh?
Yeah. It's no wonder they were all over the British Isles and all over Europe and even in North America, just conquering everywhere.
Yep. So yeah, there were a few innovations here. One in particular I thought was interesting with horse snowshoes.
I know.
I don't quite picture how that would work, but
I know in Iceland, actually, when they're riding the horses out on frozen lakes, they have shoes that have
like a cleats
in that, uses
that
spikes.
Makes more sense to me.
But I don't know what a horse snowshoe would look like and how horses would
not fall on their face.
Apparently they fall on their face all the time, Tristan.
Barbara had an experience last weekend, people.
Yes, I did. It was traumatic, guys.
Horse is okay. Barbara's okay.
Yeah, we're all okay. We're all okay. We're all okay.
Not that kind of traumatic.
Yeah, I don't know. I would also find it interesting to see what the horse, like how their walk changed. Because you know how, like, have you seen those videos of where you put like little shoes on dogs and they walk weird?
Yeah, well, that's until they're used to it at least. But
right.
Yeah.
But I'm wondering if there was there had to have been a similar process with like
snowshoe would imply bigger
than the
foot,
which then they would step on it.
Right.
Yeah.
And then they'd trip.
Yeah.
So I'm not quite.
Maybe it only splayed out towards the outside or something.
Or maybe it took some special training or something. Maybe.
Anyways, if you guys have pictures of these cool snowshoes for horses, please send them our way.
Yeah, let us know if you know anything about that or know of a good source or something.
Because
I'd like to know more.
We're obviously intrigued.
Yep. And then briefly we talk about the first possibility of horses returning to North America. So about 800 CE, there was, they did develop Newfoundland in North America. So there was a Viking settlement that is confirmed. We know this is fact. But at that site, there is no sign of any domesticated animals whatsoever.
Yeah, which is curious.
I would have thought at least like chickens or pigs.
Pigs or sheep.
Well, you know, if they had brought pigs, though, then they would have been everywhere by the time the Europeans arrived.
That's true, yeah.
Other Europeans.
Yeah.
Because I know that they definitely came in with
the Spanish.
But they're so prolific in the Americas that they would have been everywhere already.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
So interesting. Vikings are cool.
Everyone loves some Vikings.
Yeah. For
now,
real. And
anyway.
then Icelandic horses are just the coolest.
Yeah. So next up is titled The Return. And so this is when horses finally do return to North America. We start off talking about Christopher Columbus, but he doesn't need to be talked about too much because he's not that great.
No. But he apparently did transport horses to the New World.
Yeah.
So I'll give him that, I guess.
There doesn't seem to be indication right now that caused horses to spread naturally through the New World.
No, because he landed on islands.
Right.
You can only get so far from an island.
Right.
You know?
But they were definitely there.
And it's interesting because Hispaniola, and I never really thought in the Dominican Republic and stuff, apparently the horses that he brought just kind of were left to roam wild, which I guess then the indigenous cultures were like, hey.
It didn't take folks long to figure out, this is a useful thing.
Yeah.
And as we'll see too, this actually is a useful tool against the Spanish and the English and stuff too.
Yeah. So I did think it was interesting, how indigenous cultures took to the horse so quickly and then kicked butt on the Europeans who brought the horses. That was fun. That's probably my favorite part of this book.
Yeah, me too. I did also like that European documents say there were no horses until 1680, but once again, research and Native American traditions have said that is wrong. That is incorrect.
Yeah, and I do love that the archaeology can prove the oral histories of the indigenous cultures.
Yep.
That makes me so happy.
So yeah, there were several possible introductions of horses, but generally speaking, we didn't think until maybe 1540 or a little before 1680 that we started to see.
And I did think it was cool how, or at least interesting how the Spanish, when they came to Florida particularly, but throughout the West too, they supposedly had very strict rules on who could own horses and very tight. In the written documents, it sounds like they had really tight ownership, and in reality, pretty much everybody who could get a horse got a horse, including indigenous folk. And I think it's really important to note that even though the Spanish brought disease and a lot of other really bad things to Native American cultures, the horse allowed them to, at least, it wasn't necessarily a level playing field, but it did help them to maintain, what's the right word? Independence? Sovereignty for a little bit longer than they would have otherwise.
Yeah. Some cases a fair bit longer too.
Yeah, actually, that's true.
Yeah. Like you would expect based off of the rest of the world, horses had a pretty big dramatic cultural impact in the Americas. They were not eaten too often, but we start to see lots of materials and stuff, new innovations on the technology. We start to see new horse colors, such as the paint.
And the Appaloosa.
And the Appaloosa, one of my favorites.
Yeah.
Yeah, so a lot of cultural innovations, a lot of disruption between Native American groups as well.
I thought it was cool too, in the Great Plains, having the horse allowed them to essentially construct larger teepees because the horses could transport them. So like even their homes were able to become bigger. And just it's horses had these had their hoofs and things that you wouldn't necessarily directly connect with horse culture and how it would change their society.
Well, and some tactics and gear that go with those tactics, like being able to ride sideways on a horse so that you were covered by the horse's body.
I know.
Developed here.
Like, that is cool.
Yeah, that's pretty cool and pretty darn daring, it sounds like to me, too.
I wouldn't do it.
I mean, if you're being shot at, then yeah.
I mean, I guess it's a necessity, but yeah, it was really interesting. It was cool to see how not only did they like pick up horseback riding, but they kind of made it their own and made it work for them.
Yeah. Also very important is the impact horses had on hunting of buffalo.
Oh, yeah.
Because previously, and we've seen this archaeologically for thousands of years, people would do buffalo runs or they'd have to build very, very detailed traps. And the hunting of buffalo took a lot of coordination. And now you have horses that are trained to specifically ride alongside buffalo, and a single person can take down a buffalo.
Yeah.
Which interesting, they pointed out that buffalo are the only surviving megafauna from the Ice Age.
Yeah, I guess that would be
the only
true.
herbivores to survive the end of the Ice Age. He didn't say in North America, he said worldwide is what the implication with the phrasing there. So I'm not sure if that's quite true worldwide or if he just meant North America. Because it's definitely true in the North Americas, I'd say. Well, moose are pretty big. Yeah, there were giant moose, weren't there?
I don't know. I was just wondering about that as you said that. I was like, I don't know.
They're practically megafauna now.
Right. And something I also, because I always got to point out the ladies, was how during this time period, saddles were modified for both men and women riders. And they had, specific saddles for different purposes and specific equipment for different purposes as well, which how innovative. Cool.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, there's a lot of cool rebalancing and adjusting of cultural dynamics and intercultural dynamics and everything going on here.
And I also, the ceremonial stuff that kind of went around with horses with the painting of them for battle and things like that. And I know, I think it's in Calgary, they have, and it might be in other places too, but the Indian relays, which are kind of horse relay racing. It's really cool. I've always wanted to go check it out, but a lot of that stems from the culture that was developed during this period. Maybe one day I'll get out there and check it out.
So horses are now showing up in places they've never been before. And I was aware a lot of the Great Plains in North America and the Native American relationship with horses. I was aware of a lot of that situation. But next we're going to get into a bunch of other cultures and regions and how people adapted to this new animal and built real partnerships with it. A quick aside, if you know someone who's into horses and listens on the commute, this episode is probably a good fit.
Yeah, so in this chapter, again, we have the Spanish, because they were everywhere in the Americas.
Yep.
And this is about bringing horses. It starts out with bringing horses to South and Central America, to different cultures down there. The Inca specifically is mentioned. And I hadn't really thought much about, I know there's a very big modern horse culture, but I had never really thought about the early, when horses arrived and how that worked. I still, when thinking of South America, I still think of the alpaca, So this was an interesting chapter for me. And I guess the alpaca was used alongside horses.
Alpaca and one that I hadn't heard of before.
Oh, yeah. Guanaco.
Yeah. Here we see once again, there is some cultures able to resist and be a real pain in the Spanish side because they have horses specifically.
Which, again, I love.
I'm all for that. There are several cases where horses could be introduced to different regions in these areas based off of failed colonies and such. But we don't always know exactly what led to horses being in the area or not, from what I can gather.
I thought it was cool, too, that, prior to the horse, they relied on bow and arrows, at least primarily. I'm sure they had other weapons as well. But with the advent of horseback riding and using them for battle, they switched to the lance and the bola, which I was like, wow, yeah, a bola from horseback. I would run the other way.
Yeah. Well, and
I probably wouldn't get far.
The bola was, I guess, particularly used for an ostrich-like animal in South America. I didn't know they had an animal like that in South America.
Yeah, I don't know if I'm pronouncing this right, but the rhea, R-H-E-A.
Which I think I've heard that name before. I guess I just didn't know where they were from. I probably assumed Australia because that just seems like an Australian thing.
Because all the weird, funky, crazy animals are Australian.
But I can see how a bola would be very effective against an animal like that in particular.
And I guess there were, again, it seems like wherever the Spanish go, there is a feral horse population. Because even here in Florida, we still have feral horses from the Spanish. And the people there made use of them for food, essentially. So we're still eating horses, apparently, in this book. And again, I thought it was interesting the specialized veterinary practices you can see in the archaeological record.
These are practices that were, well, sometimes we have historic record of it too.
True,
right?
yes.
I wanted to note because we have 1800s observations from a man named George Chatworth Musters, which has to be the most British sounding name I've ever heard. I thought that was very funny.
And I guess they even have, in the archaeological record, they found that people were building corrals and enclosures. And I don't know if they didn't do that before, and this, or if, because he didn't, this is the first time the author is mentioning it. So I don't know if other cultures did that or he just didn't.
Other cultures had to do that because they were doing it for cattle and stuff.
Yeah.
But not in pastoral societies necessarily.
Right. Yeah.
But maybe they developed that specifically for horses here. Maybe they weren't doing it with the alpacas and stuff.
Yeah, I don't know. And again, like the Great Plains cultures, they were using European tack horse riding equipment, but they, again, would kind of alter it to their needs.
Depending on what's available.
Yeah. So pretty cool.
Yeah. Horseshoes made from hides.
I'm
picturing your dog shoes.
My little dog shoes again.
Yeah. I don't know what else that would be, really.
That's I think how it would have to be.
Unless you press them and layer them or something, and maybe that's hard enough to be useful. Because I don't know how you would not have a horse wear through that in a day.
Right, yeah.
Barbara, from what you told me, you could use the special straps for training them to stand during mounting and dismounting.
For real. I am the queen of falling off horses at the mounting block, people. It's embarrassing. That's okay.
Probably more controlled than most other places to fall off a horse.
You would think so.
Yeah.
It still hurts.
Hey, next we go to Australia, or the Australia regions. And, I mean, it's really kind of a similar story in a lot of ways. Some regions, the Indigenous people were killed off or pushed out too quickly to really develop a horse relationship. But where that didn't happen, they got pretty deep horse relationships like everywhere else, it seems like.
Yeah. And I guess he mentions here that, and I'm sure this happened in other places too, but in addition to the horses, the European settlers brought in other animals like sheep, goat, cattle, camels. And I guess I actually learned recently from a friend that camels are a huge problem right now in Australia. Like they have wild herds of camels. So that's a fun aside.
I could kind of see that.
Yeah.
Being wild camels sound like a problem in general.
It's apparently a huge issue. And I was like, what? I had no idea. But he went to Australia recently and that's what he learned.
Okay.
And it seems like horse transport had like a huge impact on how roads and like towns were linked in colonial Australia.
Oh, that's like our towns today though too.
Yeah. And I was kind of surprised. I feel like we talk a lot about horses as transport in this book, but not as much as I would have thought about how they changed transport.
Yeah, I can't speak to everywhere, but like on the plains in like Nebraska, where I grew up, towns are all about 10 to 15 miles away.
That's probably what a horse could ride in a day.
That's about a day trip.
Yeah.
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 Or a round trip maybe or something, but yeah, that's about what they all are paced out to be.
Yeah.
And then railroads came through and changed all that, and now cars are changing it more, of course, but that is originally why they were laid out that way. And yeah, you see that in other parts of the world too. There's other stuff in here, but it all feels kind of redundant from things we talked about before.
Yeah, I'm kind of trying to see if there's... And similar to other cultures, when the British settlers brought horses to New Zealand, obviously the Maori. The Maori integrated them into their culture, and they became, again, like we saw in many other societies, markers of social prestige, essentially. And I guess they were very important in diplomatic gifting, which I thought was really cool. I mean, if anybody wants to diplomatically gift me a horse, I'd take it.
So yeah, a similar situation in Hawaii, I think, too.
Yeah. He talks
very
about
socially
Hawaii.
important in gifting.
Oh, I guess one funny aside before we go to chapter 16 was, I guess he talks about how, they were on almost every continent, even briefly during Antarctica, but they died.
You don't say.
I thought that was great. That's a great way to end that chapter.
Next chapter moves on to the beginning of not quite the end of horses, but the end of horses as prominent parts of human lives.
Yes.
That's how I guess I'd phrase it, because we start to see development of of railroads, steam engines. I was amused at the mentions of steam wagons and attempts at steam wagons that never turned out very well.
So when we were in Detroit for that conference earlier in January, I went to one of the like automobile museums, and they had one of those like horseless carriages that were essentially like a horse carriage but motorized.
Yeah, but that was with a gas engine, I bet.
I can't remember. Yes.
That was initially what they were. Yeah.
But oh my gosh, those things look like death traps.
Yeah. Well, I have a fun story about steam wagons because anyone who knows the Oregon Trail, used to be people would start the Oregon Trail at Nebraska City, then travel upriver to the Platte River and then start cutting across to the west. And eventually they realized, well, we just go straight to the Platte River cutoff and go west. And that's where Omaha, Nebraska is now. So Nebraska City is like, oh no, we're in trouble. So they make a cutoff route to the Oregon Trail from them going across land. And they plow like 100 miles of it. And they had a guy come in and bring in his steam wagon. And, there's great big fanfare, and the steam wagon trundles out of town. And about, 5-10 miles out of town, it breaks down. And he goes back to New York to get, parts of something, and they never hear from him again. But there are people alive today who remember going and having picnics at the old steam wagon. And there's actually a road still named Steam Wagon Road in that city.
Oh, wow.
So I just thought that's a cool story.
You start talking about the Oregon Trail, and I start thinking about like the game and the trauma.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a generational reference for sure, though.
Yes.
If anyone is curious about that game and gives it a go, don't name your people in the wagon train after people you like. Just a tip.
I used to name mine all my siblings, then I would tell them who died of what.
Yeah, like you just like my point, basically.
Yeah.
But yeah, interestingly, this didn't eliminate demand for horses right away. It actually in some ways increased it because you're bringing in railroads, and now you need some way of moving it from that point to wherever it needs to go, towns or industries or something. And so actually there's more demand for horses for a while at least. But of course, like Barbara said, the steam wagon starts up, and then with World War I is when it really started to take over, because then they started developing them for war and put effort into making them work and cheap.
And I remember, so my mom grew up in England, and she remembers hearing stories of during World War I, horses played such a large role in combat, mostly like hauling things, and people would hide their horses, like farmers and things, because at that time, the horses were what plowed the fields, right? You didn't have a motorized tractor, and the military would come in and just confiscate your horses. And so people would hide their horses in their houses and all sorts of places to try and keep them safe from the military, because the military would just use them until they died.
Right.
And, they didn't give them veterinary care or anything, which is,
or return them.
War, what?
Or return them, I would assume.
Or no, they would not return them. And so they would just come in and take them, and then you're left unable to plow your fields. So for these families, it was a huge deal. And my mom used to tell me stories about that. And as a kid, I was just like horrified. And then I went with her to go see War Horse, and we both cried. So it was very traumatic.
Was War Horse World War I or II?
It was I.
Okay. I know there were some horses in World War II, but not much.
But I think World War I, it was very horse heavy.
I'm sure it was. Yeah. And so the final chapter for this episode and for the book, simply titled Hoof Prints. And so this is kind of a lament, perhaps, about how horses are kind of, on the margins of everything now. They're still around, but they have nowhere near the prominence they once did.
I did like how he talked about, especially in American culture, the horse, especially out west, still holds this like place of reverence, especially in everything from like fashion to, you see it in the Budweiser Clydesdales, and things like that.
Sports teams, the Broncos, right?
Yep. Yeah, the Broncos. But I thought it was interesting, and I did get mad because he talks about horse riding has become the purview of either the elite equestrian hobby rider or the rural rancher. And the equestrian, like modern equestrian, like especially in English riding, they're trying to really, really hard to level the field a little bit and make it more of an accessible hobby. So I was like, oh, I got a little annoyed at that.
I mean, maybe it's not necessarily untrue right now then still, though, but there's an effort towards fixing that.
Yeah. There's different like teams you can join where you don't even have to own a horse, and the show venue provides the horses and stuff like that in an effort to like make it more accessible. So I was just like, oh, quit calling it elite. That doesn't help our cause.
Help our cause.
But I'm not saying it's cheap. It's not cheap.
No, but I think one quote from the book to send this off: although solving the immense challenges of the 21st century is certainly beyond the current abilities of archaeology, new research and new technologies do hold the promise of a future where better knowledge of the past helps inform our modern problem solving. And that kind of sums up a lot of why archaeology is important.
Yes.
And I think this is something we've touched on in this podcast multiple times.
Oh yeah, it's something you and I feel very strongly about.
Yeah, it has a lot of benefits, and that is definitely one of them.
And he also mentions how archaeology can do a lot to not get rid of. I'll read his quote because he says it better than I can. But he says, within archaeology itself, Indigenous archaeologists are working tirelessly to strip racism, bias, and colonial thought from the interpretation of horses and horse culture in the archaeological record. And I think, again, going back to, having the culture who is being studied, having archaeologists from that culture work, I think it makes a huge difference. So I was glad to see that he threw that in there.
Acknowledge that and acknowledge its importance.
Mm-hmm.
Yep, agreed. All right, I think that wraps up Hoof Beats, Barbara.
Yeah.
What did you think?
I mean, there wasn't a single mention of dressage, but I'll get over it. I liked it. I feel like the ending was a little rushed. I feel like he went really into depth into the like origin story, and I would have liked to hear more about how the different cultures utilize the horses. But overall, I really liked it.
Yeah, I think we were seeing a bit of his personal interest and expertise in what I think is like the steppe region.
Yeah. And like I said, it's his book. He gets to write about what he wants.
Yeah. But when we have not necessarily living memory, but cultures and oral traditions and historical records talking about some of these things, I feel like there's more opportunity to go into more depth than he did for some of these too.
Yeah.
But there are definitely archaeologists out there who are clearly more interested in the most ancient things possible and less interested in more recent things. And that's kind of, we're pushing back on it a little bit, probably because we are the opposite.
Yes, we're the historic archaeology nerds. Yes.
So take that into account. Who would you recommend this book for?
Honestly, well, archaeologists. I think because this is just a different kind of aspect of archaeology, looking at the relationship with animals. I don't think a lot of archaeologists have really dealt with that or read about it. It's not something that's really taught. But also horse people. I think having an understanding, like I've learned to have a little bit more of an appreciation for how far we've come with horses. Like they were apparently testy creatures. Not that they aren't now, but it's just interesting to see how that relationship has evolved. And it gives me more of an appreciation of how I can get on the back of this giant prey animal and it listens to me most of the time. That's pretty cool.
I think this is not a book for general audiences. I think it is too information dense for most people. If you're deeply interested in horses and horse past, I think there's a lot of benefit for you there. Professional, of course, I agree with you on that for sure. If you do decide to read it, and it is worth reading, I would recommend not stressing out about, all the named cultures and everything.
Oh yeah.
Let that kind of go by, and if it's important, they'll come up again, and then you'll start to understand what they're doing and stuff. So don't stress about that too much. But it is good. There's a lot of good information in there. Like we talked about, it struck us how big of an impact the wheel had on human society and how horses were really kind of scary when people started using them at first, and how wild it is that people started using them at all.
You can't domesticate a zebra.
Dan the donkey. You do not want to mess with Dan the donkey. Did we talk about Dan in the podcast much more?
Dan the zebra?
Dan the zebra. Yes. One of the Dan the Zebra stories I remember is apparently they tried to crossbreed him with horses, and they had to physically separate him from the mare or he would have killed them. That is one crazy little equid.
Yeah, to mess with because usually it's the mare you got to worry about.
And I assume the mare was probably bigger than him.
I don't know. Because zebras aren't really that big, I don't think.
No, I think they're very stocky and wiry, but yeah. So Dan was something else, and actually they still have his skin and bones in the Smithsonian. And I think, boy, I want to be such a thumb in the eye of the establishment that they keep my skin and bones around.
I like a good animal character,
Yeah.
Dan had Moxie.
Yep, agreed. But coming back to this book, I think this book I would recommend for fewer people than some of our previous ones, especially like our last one, for example. That one's for practically anybody.
Yeah.
This one is definitely for people who are very invested in the subject for one reason or another.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
So take that into account, but I enjoyed it. I'm glad we read it.
Yay, horses.
Yay, horses.
I got my horse book in. I'm happy.
All right, so I think that wraps up Hoof Beats here once and for all. What is our next book going to be, Barbara?
Okay, I'm pretty excited about this, Tristan. We will be reading the second book in Mariana Evans, a Faye Longchamp Mystery. It's called Relics. And you'll remember, almost 2 years ago now.
Almost on the nose.
Yeah, we read Mariana Evans' first in this series called Artifacts. So we're really excited to continue that mystery series. And I think it'll be a good book to follow this up with. It's much lighter. It's fiction. And it's the first one, Artifacts, was really good. We both enjoyed that.
Yeah, we liked that one in particular because it also was written in the area of Florida we live in, so we kind of knew some of the areas that they're talking about. This will be, I think, in a different place, but it'll be at, I think she uses real archaeological sites, she said in our interview, which you can go and listen to.
Yeah.
Of course, we'll make it accessible so that you can actually follow along. But if you want to listen to the other episodes ahead of time, you can find them online, and I will link to them as well. You can do that if you so prefer. But I think that's all we've got today. So once again, we'll see you all next time.
Happy reading, everybody.